Okay, hi guys. So from the previous lesson, we talked about Newton's first law, and in Newton's first law, there was the last bit. A moving object will be in constant motion, meaning that a moving object will keep moving and it will not stop. But we found out that something will stop it in the end because there's an opposing force, right? So what are the opposing forces that we talked about the previous lesson that we did not cover? The first one is friction, and the second one is air resistance. And so for today, we will talk about friction. So hopefully you're ready. Let's go. So as we come to this slide, we're looking at a GIF of a man, and what's actually happening here? Why is he slipping so much? This has to do with the next part of our lesson on forces, which is friction. As you can tell, he has no friction under his feet. That is why he's slipping all the time. But what exactly is this friction? Well, I suppose some of you could just say, Thầy ơi, friction is a force because we are learning about force. Well, you're correct. Friction is a force, but how does this force come about? Let's take a look at what friction really is. So let's take a look at the definition of friction. What is friction? Friction is a force that opposes motion or movement between two surfaces that are in contact, meaning touching each other. So friction is a force that is against movement between two surfaces or two objects that are touching. Okay, so now that we know that when you have friction, when you rub two surfaces together, it'll create a force. And with enough force, you create some energy and... Okay, so let's go into the next part of the lesson to find out what affects friction, all right? The first thing that affects friction is the surfaces that's on, and the second one is the force on friction. Let's go. So, how does the surface on an object create friction? Well, when surfaces are in contact, the microscopic hills and valleys of one surface stick to, well, actually touch or rub against the hills and valleys of the other surface, and that causes friction. If you look at this picture over here of the box on the floor is smooth, but actually there are little bumps on it, little hills and valleys, and at the bottom of the box are also little hills and valleys. So when these two surfaces rub against each other, that causes friction. It doesn't allow movement to occur easily. Microscopic hills and valleys. When we look at certain surfaces or objects, we can tell that it is smooth because it's shiny, or when we feel it, it feels really smooth. But actually, when we take a microscopic view of the surface, we will actually notice that these surfaces are not smooth at all. So the surface on the left actually is the surface of a piece of glass. Glass is really smooth. Yeah, it is. But at a microscopic level, you can see that it's really rough. And what about the thing on the right? This picture on the right is also a very smooth surface that's always shiny. And this is the surface of metal. Not all metals look the same. This is a type of metal, and it actually produces these really interesting shapes. So, doesn't that make it interesting to know that friction is actually caused by these rough surfaces that we can't see? Well, there's more to learn. So the other factor that affects friction is the force on friction. The amount of friction depends on the force pushing the surfaces together. If this force increases, the hills and valleys of the surfaces can come into closer contact. So what does that mean? So it means that if I have a heavier book like the one in yellow, it's pressing down more on the surface. And because of that, the surfaces meet closer, the hills and valleys are pressed together even more. And how does that affect friction? Okay, so all surfaces have hills and valleys, really small ridges, really small bits that goes up and down. And that creates friction when you rub them together, even though the surface looks so smooth. I mean, the one on glass is pretty amazing. I've never seen glass that close up. So Hopefully that was good for you, interesting for you too. So, sometimes when you find out something in your lessons you don't really understand, do your research. Go home, look up a video. I've taught you that many times. Just go ahead and do it. And the second one, which is very interesting, is that when two surfaces meet, right? If there's a weight on it, there's a force acting on it, it will cause more friction. I mean, it's pretty obvious, if you're heavier, it's more energy for you to run, move, things like that. All right? So, now we'll go on to the two types of friction. Like, what? We have two types of friction? I don't like physics. Good luck. We will finish up our lesson on friction by talking about the two types of friction there are. The first one is kinetic friction. The word kinetic means moving. So kinetic friction is the friction between moving surfaces. The amount of kinetic friction between two surfaces depends on how the surfaces move. Surfaces can slide past each other or can roll over each other. Usually, the force of sliding kinetic friction is greater than the force of rolling kinetic friction. It's easier to move objects on wheels than to slide the objects along the floor. And the second type of friction is called static friction. Do you remember the word static? We talked about it during our lesson on non-contact forces. The word came up, static electricity. So what does this word static mean? When a force is applied to an object but does not cause it to move, static friction occurs. The word static means not moving. The object does not move because the force of static friction balances the force applied. So what that means is that the force that you're using to push the object is not great enough to overcome the static friction, and thus it does not move. But if it moves, what happens is static friction then disappears as soon as the object starts moving, and then kinetic friction replaces the static friction. So to illustrate this better for you, let's take a look at these two pictures. Alright, that wasn't so bad, was it? Two types of friction, static friction and kinetic friction. Static meaning not moving because you don't have enough energy pushing it forward. And you have kinetic energy. That's when your object has a force act on it and it has started to move. Alright guys, hopefully that was easy for you. Remember your summary sheets and I'll see you next time. Bye!